going to have a discussion about alkane side chains. Now, looking at some molecules here, the actual side chains can get complicated very fast. And once we found our parent chain, we can figure out the types of hydrocarbons that are hanging off and start to name those types of hydrocarbons. So the main thing, the starting point is that we know that we have a side chain of an alkyl group, how many carbons are involved in it. And if it's fairly straightforward, one carbon hanging off a CH3. We would call that a methyl. So instead of a methane, this is the base chain name, we would call it a methyl group. If it was two carbons, it would be an ethyl. If it's three carbons, it's a propyl. Four carbons, butyl. Five carbons, pentyl, and so on and so forth. And it looks pretty straightforward. But the problem is that as we start to get to three carbons and more, we actually have some isomers, meaning different arrangement of atoms that actually give us a different style of structure, and they need to be named differently. So, for example, if we were to go to the propyl groups, we can see that if I have a straight chain that is 9 carbons in length, a nonane, and I have a 3 carbon chain hanging off, I can call it a propyl group. But is it a straight chain hanging off, or in this case here, is it hanging off this second carbon here? And so it turns out there's a couple of different ways of naming that. We need to show the difference between these two types of structures that are hanging off here. So the proposed and preferred IUPAC way of naming right now is to just call this a 4-propyl nonane. So 1, 2, 3, 4 in the 4 position is this nonane. And so in the past, we would sometimes write the 1-propyl to say that this number 1 carbon of the propyl is the part that's attached to the main chain. But it looks like IUPAC has decided we're going to just ignore that now. And if it says propyl, the assumption is it's going to be a straight chain. The other old school way of doing it, common naming, is this N, and this refers to normal. And so this is something that was used in the past. It's a common naming. It's not used very often, and we moved into this, and now we've dropped the 1 or the N altogether. And so if you have a straight chain propyl group, you're just going to call it propyl. And similarly, if you have a straight chain butyl group or a straight chain pentyl group, you're just going to call it butyl or pentyl. You're not going to have a 1 or an N in front of it anymore. The problem then is when you start to get the isomers of that side chain. So in the past, a common name for this would have been isopropyl. So there's 1, 2, 3 carbons. It's a propyl group. And in this configuration, we're going to call it an isopropyl. That is a common name. IUPAC decided that they wanted to break it down even further. And so this side chain here is actually a 2-carbon side chain with a methyl group in the 1 position. The 1 position meaning this is the carbon that's attached to the main chain. So this is the number 1 carbon. There's a methyl in the 1 position, and now this is an ethyl side chain. So 1-methyl ethyl. And now the IUPAC has decided that they want to then say that this is a propane group, and in the 2 position here, so this would be a propanol group, and in the 2 position is where this carbon is. And so that's essentially the way that IUPAC wants to go with this now. And we're going to see that this, it's a bit of an improvement. It starts to get a bit complicated as we start to get to the larger carbon chains. So let's try butane. So we have some information here from Wikipedia. It's a great source for scientific information. And so this is the resource right here. But what they've got a nice table here that shows the common names, the preferred IUPAC name, the systematic, the old name, and now an alternate solution. So this is kind of where they're trying to head to. This is also the IUPAC preferred name here, right here. So common naming then, N-butyl, so for normal, N for normal, sec for secondary, or meaning that there's 2 groups. So if this is the main carbon chain, main carbon attached to the chain, there's 1, 2 substituents hanging off of it. So 1, 2. So that's where that secondary comes from. This group here is called an isobutyl. So this carbon is attached to the main chain. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. This is an isobutyl in the common name. And finally, we have a carbon attached here with 1, 2, 3 substituents hanging off of it, 3 methyl groups. This is called a tert-butyl group. And so IUPAC now has changed it in the old system. This would have been just called butyl. And now if I had the longest chain, 1, 2, 3, this would have been a propyl, and then the one position here is a 1-methyl propyl, so that would have been an old system of naming. And now similarly 1, 2, 3. This is a propyl group, but in the 2 position here is the methyl as well. And then finally 1, 2, this is an ethyl group, and in the 1 position and in the 1 position is 2 methyls. So it's a 1,1 dimethyl ethyl. So that would have been the side chain. So what it's changed to now is now IUPAC wants to say this is just a butyl group. So there's no N, there's no, you can put a 1, but they would prefer if you don't, that's the preferred way. And now if you have a, in this case here, like a sec-butyl type group, they would like the butan 2-yle. So butan 2-yle or il would be the preferred way of naming it. And if we go to isobutyl, then it would be a 2-methyl propyl. So you can see there's a bit of a difference here, but if you want, you can continue on using the similar sort of naming system here if it's easier for you. I believe that this is, because now we start to get a couple of different ones. And now what IUPAC has done is gone back to the tert-butyl and decided we're going to maintain this tert-butyl. So this is actually an IUPAC preferred name. So this common type naming that's been used in the past that was switched over to 1-methyl, 1,1-dimethyl ethyl is going back to tert-butyl. So a little bit of a confusion there. But hopefully this table spells out a bit of the possibilities of what you can do when you're naming these compounds. So when we get to the pentane group, it gets even more complicated. So the IUPAC status, they're not even telling us what the recommended ones are anymore. But essentially the common names, so an N-pentyl, tert-pentyl, neopentyl, isopentyl. You can see how many different types there are now as we get to a 5-carbon chain, how many isomers there are. It gets quite complicated. So IUPAC is now recommending, again, straight chain, just call it a pentyl group. And so if it is if you start to get some deviations from that, this 1,1-dimethyl propyl is now the preferred would be this 2-methyl butan 2-yle. So it's a 4-carbon chain, and in the 2 position is a methyl. This one here is a propyl chain, and in the 2 position are 2 methyl groups, and so on and so forth. A butyl group that in the 3 position there is a methyl group, and this one would be a pentane group, but in the 2-carbon of the pentane is attached to the main chain name. The other way of naming that would have been as a butyl group, so a 4-carbon chain that's attached with a 1-methyl group hanging off that butyl group in the 1 position. This one here would be the 5-carbon chain, but it's attached in the 3 position. And previously we would have said that there was a 3-carbon chain hanging off, so that would have been the longest carbon chain. And in the 1 position of that 3-carbon chain is an ethyl group. And so IUPAC is going back to this one instead, and so on and so forth. So as we keep going forth. So you can see as we get through these, it starts to get quite complicated. So let's try some examples here. I've got a 2-carbon side chain, a 3-carbon side chain, 4-carbon side chains, and the 5-carbon side chain. I only have the one here. So what we're going to be dealing with then is trying to figure out what name we should be trying to apply to each of these essentially. So very straightforward for a 2-carbon chain. I have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is an octane in the 1, 2, 3, 4 position, or the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 position. IUPAC wants the lower number, so in the 4 position is an ethyl group. So this is 4-ethyl octane. If we go to the 3-carbon side chain in the 1, 2, 3, 4 position, 5, 6, 7, 8, this is an octane, this is an octane. We have in the 4 position, this is a propyl group. So we would just say 4-propyl octane. We would not have an N or a 1 in front of it. So just propyl, and the assumption is that is a straight chain. If we want to denote that we have not the straight chain and that it's on this 2nd carbon here, IUPAC would suggest that we use the 4-propan 2-yle octane. So that would be the preferred way to actually name this. The older way of naming it I'll have listed here as well. So when we get to the 4-carbon side chain, in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, this is a decane. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 5 is the position for the butyl group. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a straight chain, so we would just say 5-butyl decane, and that would be the answer for this one. The assumption is because we say butyl that it is the straight chain. If we have any deviation and use a different isomer for this, now we start to get complicated. So in the 1, 2, 3, 4 position, we have a butyl group 1, 2, 3, 4, but we've got essentially now three ways of naming this. I could call this a sec butyl. Also up here, we could have called this an isopropyl as well. So an isopropyl group. I forgot about that. So up here, we could have called this a sec butyl. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. This is the carbon. There's two groups attached to it, and so that's why it's called a secondary butyl. So two groups attached to it. So sec butyl would be the older common name of weighing this. Sorry, of of naming this. IUPAC then decided that they said, okay, well, let's say that it's a 1, 2, 3 longest carbon chain here. This is going to be a propane. So it'll be a propyl group. And in the one position, the one meaning the carbon that's attached to the main chain, in the one position is a methyl. So it would have been a 1-methyl propyl. But the newer way of naming now is IUPAC wants us to say it is a butane group, but in the second carbon is what's attached. So butan-2-il is the preferred way of naming it with IUPAC. So now we're going to try to do a different isomer of this. So in the past, this would have been in the 5 position, this would have been an isobutyl group. But now we want to now recognize that this is 1, 2, 3. So this is a propyl group, and in the 2 position is a methyl. So this is a 2-methyl propyl group. So you can see why it would have been of interest, I think, to keep the 1-methyl propyl group if we're going to go to the 2-methyl propyl, but that's what happens here. And finally, for the last example, so in the 5 position here, this is now just called a tert-butyl group. So that is now the preferred way of going. If we were to continue with the older kind of IUPAC way of naming, we would have said this is an ethyl group right here, and in the 1 position is a methyl, and in the 1 position is a methyl. So we could have said it was a 1,1-dimethyl ethane hanging off in the 5 position. For the 5 carbon side chain, I'm only going to do the one example because it gets fairly complicated. And in most of the work that we do, we don't have these very, very large side chains. But this one here, it is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a pentyl group. It's attached in the 3 position. So IUPAC wants us to call this a pentan-3-il decane. So that would be the preferred way of naming that. So there is one more fun thing to go about. So in IUPAC, when we name the substituents in the continuous with the parent chain all combined together, we're going to write them in alphabetical order. And so here is a fun thing that happens when you're writing things in alphabetical order, especially using the common name. But the thing to note here is that this essentially N-butyl, this is 2 words. And sec-butyl, this is essentially 2 words. Isobutyl is 1 word, and tert-butyl is 2 words. So the group here is the butyl group. The group is the butyl group. The group is the isobutyl group. The group is the butyl group. So alphabetically, this falls under B, and this falls under B. This falls under I, and this falls under B. Similarly, for the isopropyl, if we were to call this isopropyl, the I is actually alphabetical. That's what we need to use for alphabetical, not the P for propyl. It's the I. Whereas in this case, this is the group, the ethyl group is the alphabetical group that we would consider. And in this one here, the propan-2-il, the P is for alphabetical. So we really, really need to keep this in mind when we're dealing with the side chains, what it is specifically that's being referred to. The propyl group, the ethyl group with the side chain hanging off the ethyl group, the isopropyl group. This is the actual isomer of this 3-chain carbon that's attached. And similarly here, when we get to the N-butyl, this is a normal butyl group. This is the second or secondary butyl group. This is an isobutyl group, 1 word. So the I is the alphabetical. And then this is the tertiary butyl group. So please pay attention to that. When we get to the 5 carbon chain, you can see it can start to get very complicated very quickly. Normal pentyl, tertiary, neopentyl. So the N would actually be the key word there. Isopentyl. Secondary, the P for pentyl would be the letter. Secpentyl, again, the I, so secondary isopentyl. The I would be for alphabetical, and active pentyl, P would be the one. So we got to really be conscious of that when we're actually dealing with alphabetical order. So the hope is that IUPAC, it's a little bit easier, I think, to decide where the alphabetized sort of organization of the side groups is. And with the alternate notation, they're trying to kind of make it a little bit easier, I think, overall.